And good afternoon, everyone, from Columbia, Missouri, and not the home of the Missouri Institute of Mental Health. We took our show on the road today, and we're really glad that you joined us out here. We're going to do a program called Understanding Deaf Culture, and I'll introduce our speaker to you in just a moment. My name's Tom Pansella with the Missouri Institute of Mental Health, and I thank you very much for being with us. You'll see underneath the video window that we have our open captioning service again provided. We welcome our Caption First CART transcriber. We're glad to provide this service for you, and we hope you find it useful. Below that, you'll also see several other links. You'll see a link to the speaker's slides. You can pop those up in a separate window if you like. There's also a link to purchase CEUs. The CEUs are only $15 a person. We'll leave that link open during the program and send it to you in a follow-up email as well. Our speaker today is one of our brilliant presenters that's going to be a part of our Spring Training Institute that's coming up at the end of May, right after Memorial Day. So if you're anywhere near Missouri during that time of year, please join us for that program. It is an outstanding program, and there are links to that information as well at the bottom of the screen. Off on the right side, in the right column, you'll also see how we'd like you to submit questions or comments anytime during the program today, and I do stress anytime. Please feed us your questions that you'd like us to ask to our presenter during the program, and we will do so on your behalf. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Elijah Buchholz, and he is the Director of Deaf Services for the Missouri Department of Mental Health. And for about the past 6 years, he's provided mental health and substance abuse services to the deaf community. He's conducted numerous trainings for both mental health clinicians and interpreters across Missouri and in Kansas. Elijah, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Like he said, my name is Elijah Buchholz, Director of Deaf Services for the Missouri Department of Mental Health. Just to give you a little bit of background, I was born and raised into a deaf family, meaning I have parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins that are all deaf. So I was raised in the deaf culture and using American Sign Language as my native language. I also did get a counseling degree and worked at Kansas City as a counselor and creating a deaf program there for a number of years where we did both substance abuse and mental health treatment. And as Tom said, please feel free anytime to ask questions. This will be about a 45-minute presentation, kind of a preview to a longer presentation I'll do at the Spring Institute. And we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for some question and answer, Q&A session type thing. But anytime a question pops up, feel free to ask. So as we get into the presentation today, I have it divided into two parts. So we'll spend about half the time just kind of discussing deaf culture. And my goal is to give those of you that are participating a little better understanding of deafness as a cultural group, as well as some key factors that might come into play in a mental health setting. And then we'll spend about half the time discussing how to effectively work with interpreters in a mental health setting. So the big question that we want to answer in this first part here is it a culture? And my reply to that would be yes, absolutely. It's a common misconception that deafness is just a disability. It's just an inability to hear, and that couldn't be more wrong. Deaf culture is a brilliant, vibrant, thriving culture that has its own language, has its own art, literature, has its own values and beliefs, and has its own behavioral norms. And we'll kind of touch on each one of those as we go through the cultural piece here. Now, of course, the basic foundation to any cultural group is language. Now, as I mentioned, deaf culture does have its own language, a sign language, and here in America we use what's called American Sign Language as the most prominent sign language, although there are other variations as well. And there is not one universal sign language. There are over 120 different sign languages across the world. One example would be Britain. Even though we both speak English, there is a Britain sign language. There is an American sign language that is different. The other misconception when it comes to sign language is that sign language is English in sign form. And that's not true at all. American Sign Language is actually derived from French and is a lot closer to the French language than it is to English. It's also a highly visual language, meaning rather than being obviously oral, it's visual. It's the use of hands. It's the use of facial expressions to communicate the message, to communicate the emotion and the intent of what's trying to be said. An example that I like to use is in English, we would use this sentence: the boy climbed the tree. However, as I said, American Sign Language being visual, we're trying to paint a picture, and we would sign it this way. We would say, tree, put this down, tree, boy, climbed. So you can see I'm presenting to you and drawing the picture of the tree with a boy climbing it. This is key because obviously as mental health clinicians, the way that we assess our clients, the way we diagnose them, the way we provide treatment, we provide therapeutic interventions is through language and through communication. So having a little bit better of an understanding of how deaf culture and how deaf folks use language will help when it comes to working with them in mental health. Now the trick here is not every deaf individual you're going to encounter has strong skills or fluency in American Sign Language. The opposite of fluency, of course, disfluency, is something that you'll see a lot. 87%, let me back up, 87% of deaf individuals are born into hearing families, with the majority of those families never learning sign language. In fact, the statistic for hearing fathers with deaf children is 91% of them will never learn how to speak to their children, will never learn how to sign. So a good chunk of the clients that you might see that may be deaf, there's a potential they won't have any language skills, or they'll have very low-level language skills. Let me back up here. As I said before, sign language is a visual language. It relies very heavily on facial expressions, and this can come into play in a mental health setting because there are times when a deaf individual may be expressing themselves in sign language, but it looks like they're expressing a different emotion, meaning it may look like they're angry because their face is contorted and their hands are flying fast, and that can be misinterpreted when really they're just trying to communicate a simple, easy message to you. So I have kind of a funny cartoon on here. This is a church setting. This is an interpreter interpreting for the preacher, and the preacher saying, Terry, because it looks like the interpreter's going crazy, when really he's just communicating the message. In deaf culture, deaf folks do have their own art. A lot of times this is reflected in paintings, drawings, sculptures, and a lot of these use hand shapes or hand signs or hand signals or actual signs from American Sign Language. But there is a distinct art form to the deaf culture. Another criterion being a culture is having literature. There is a deaf literature or literature in the deaf culture as well. And again, the use of sign language and being a visual language falls into the literature as well, with the literature being more not written on paper. American Sign Language does not have a written equivalent to it. So a lot of the literature in deaf culture comes from storytelling, comes from signed poetry. There are one specific modality of deaf culture poetry are called ABC poems, in which poems are signed using the hand shapes of the alphabet, like A, B, C, and they'll sign going through the whole alphabet using those hand shapes, which is a very distinct form of literature to the deaf culture. In addition, I put religion on here. There's no separate deaf religion, but there's a very different, distinct way that deaf individuals worship. It's not a typical worship service where you may go and there's music and preaching. There are different ways that they may take part in a worship service. Now, as we talk about deaf culture, I want to talk a little bit about the history of deaf culture and shared institutions. Having history and shared institutions is one of the definitions of having a culture, so I want to kind of review this for you. In addition to that, if you think about how you yourself may obtain your culture growing up, it's from your family. Traditions your family may do, values that are passed on, And as I said before, having 87% of deaf individuals being born into hearing families, these hearing families may have absolutely no experience, and most of the time they don't, have any experience with deaf culture or American Sign Language. So deaf folks tend to not acquire their deaf culture until later on in life. Oftentimes this involves the local state deaf school, where a lot of deaf individuals are sent to the school. It's a residential school. They'll stay there throughout the school year in a dormitory environment, and that may be the first time they're exposed to deaf culture and to American Sign Language. There may be folks who do not attend the deaf school and maybe are what we call mainstreamed or attend their local public hearing schools that may have no exposure or experience to deaf culture and deaf language until even way later in life, if any. So school and education is a very key component to deaf culture. So when we talk about the history of deaf education and where deaf individuals may acquire their culture, I have a chart here. It started back in 1818. This was the first time a deaf school was ever established in this country, and at that time deaf culture and sign language flourished. Teaching deaf children in their native language, teaching them to have a native language of sign language was prevalent, and as I said, the culture flourished. When we got to about 1880, there was something called the Milan Conference that took place. One of the key leaders at this Milan Conference is somebody you may be familiar with, a guy named Alexander Graham Bell, who actually had a deaf mother and a deaf wife, and in trying to invent technologies for his wife, deaf wife, and deaf mother to be able to communicate, he just kind of happened to invent the phone. Most people don't know that he was highly involved in deaf stuff and deaf education. So in 1880, he went to the Milan Conference. This was a conference of deaf educators at the time, and they were kind of split between teaching deaf children in American Sign Language and deaf culture versus teaching what we call oralism, which basically bans sign language, does not allow the use of sign language, and tries to teach deaf children how to read lips and how to speak. At that conference, oralism became the accepted modality of educating deaf individuals, and that lasted clear until about 1972 when total communication came around. Total communication involved both speaking and signing at the same time. Now, if you remember a few minutes ago, when I kind of explained the difference between English and American Sign Language with the boy climbed the tree versus, you can imagine that trying to sign that sentence while speaking it in English at the same time may cause a lot of problems. So even this method, all the way to 1972 with this new method, was still very flawed. Oftentimes there are experiences, and I can tell you from my own family, my own personal experiences with deaf schools. My brother was able to sign better than his teachers when he was in preschool, and oftentimes the teachers would speak to him and sign one-word sentences, and he'd get in trouble because he didn't understand. They would say things like, Noah, you need to go sit at the table. Now, all she's signing is table. How is he supposed to understand what he's going to do, what he's being instructed to do? It's impossible. So obviously, still a flawed method of education. It wasn't until 1986 that the theory or the idea of what we call bicultural bilingual education came about. This involves teaching children, deaf children, in their native language, educating them using American Sign Language and teaching English as a second language, as well as educating them and enriching them in deaf culture. Now the problem with this is we still do not have a real strong working model, evidence-based practice for how that idea or theory should work in a deaf school, and there's not a whole lot of deaf schools that are even attempting it. The majority of them still use total communication, and there are still schools out there that use oralism as well. One of the reasons that oralism did not work, let me rephrase that, does not work for some individuals, especially folks that are profoundly deaf, is due to the principle of trying to make them lip read. This is a very, very common myth about deaf people, that they can read lips to understand and to communicate, and it's physically impossible. Only 30% of spoken language can be seen on your mouth, meaning that your mouth only makes so many shapes. So unless I have some kind of hearing to supplement looking at your mouth, I'm not going to understand what you're saying. Being that this is a web conference, is a little more difficult to do, but one little exercise I like to use in live conferences is I'm going to mouth something to you, and wherever you are, see if you can guess what it is. Some guesses that I've heard when doing this at other conferences: Olive Garden, olive oil, olive something, all the way to Chuck E. Cheese, which I have no idea how you get those two mixed up. But what I said was, I love you. Now you can imagine if you're out at a date with somebody and you try to say, please pass the olive oil, and the girl says, woo, I love you too, what kind of communication issue that can cause. So again, only 30% of spoken language can be seen on the mouth. Therefore, lip reading, or the ability to lip read in someone who's profoundly deaf, is physically impossible and is a huge myth. So here's another little cartoon for you. If you have a hard time seeing this on your computer, or you don't have the slide, I'll read it for you. In the first picture, it's a hearing educator saying, no, use your voice, not your hands. And the caption under it says, about 30 years ago, it was considered a bad idea to allow deaf children to communicate in sign language. And the second caption shows two kids signing to each other with parents observing and saying how cute. And the caption underneath says, now hearing children are learning sign language, and everyone thinks it is very cool. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Thought that was an interesting perspective. This cartoon was actually drawn by a deaf artist, and this is a deaf perspective on how things have kind of changed just in the last several years. Let's talk a little bit now about values and beliefs in deaf culture. Now, going back to kind of giving you that history of deaf education, every step along the way, it has been hearing folks who have decided what is the best way to educate deaf folks. What is the best way to handle these deaf people? What education modality or what values and beliefs can we enforce on them? So naturally, there tends to be a disconnect or a distrust or mistrust between deaf individuals and hearing individuals. This is very important to understand when it comes to a mental health setting, because we're already fighting an uphill battle with having a hearing clinician working with a deaf client, and the language issues that are there, let alone the cultural issues are there, let alone this kind of intrinsic mistrust that's already there between a deaf individual and a hearing individual. And along those same lines, with certain deaf folks, there is a strong sense of pride in their culture and in their language. Talk about just a few behavioral norms as well. In deaf culture, there are definitely behavioral norms, ways that you're supposed to behave. For an example, how to get someone's attention. In the deaf world, it's okay to touch, to tap, to shake. My oldest deaf brother sometimes gets carried away. He's getting better now that he's older, but he sometimes likes to just whack you in the arm until you get your attention. But touch in your personal space and your bubble is very different in deaf culture than it is in hearing culture. Again, this may come to play in a mental health setting if you see a deaf person being very handsy or feeling uncomfortable because they're touching you. Personal space is just smaller. Personal bubbles are smaller. A lot of times, deaf individuals are very huggy. They like to hug. They like to hug to say hi. They hug to say goodbye. They hug to just hug. So that kind of gives you an idea of that personal space. Another way of getting attention is often to flash lights. So that's very common practice. We sometimes see that when we had deaf therapy groups. We would have lights flashing to try to get folks' attention or tell them to pay attention. That's a very normal behavioral norm. Another one that I thoroughly enjoy seeing is a hearing person when there's two deaf people talking and they have to get past them. I have seen every technique in the world, and it always cracks me up, from the Matrix move of trying to duck under them or just wait until they're done. In deaf culture, that's just because we have to use sign language, and a lot of times talking between two people, you have to face each other, and sometimes people have to walk by. You just walk by versus waiting or ducking under or matrixing. So that's the conclusion of the deaf culture section of things. So before I move on and we start discussing working effectively with interpreters, are there any questions just on the deaf culture side?
We did actually have one early on here. And the question was, if so many deaf individuals have parents who don't sign and have limited language skills, how is their educational experience impacted?
That's a great question. And again, I'm going to speak in generalities because it can be fairly individualized. But generally speaking, deaf children are sent to the deaf schools, the state schools for the deaf. Here in Missouri, it's in Fulton, Missouri, the Missouri School for the Deaf. In Kansas, it's in Olathe, Kansas, the Kansas School for the Deaf. But a lot of times these kids are sent from all across the state to the deaf school as young as preschool age, where, again, I said they will live there year-round. And we kind of went through the history of some of the education, and that's definitely highly impacted right now. So, any other questions on just deaf culture before we move forward?
Not at this time.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about how to more effectively, or how to effectively work with interpreters. To start off getting into this, I guess the first question some folks might have is, why do we need interpreters? Why should we use interpreters? First response, of course, is it's a legal mandate. It's covered federally under the Americans with Disability Act, the right to have accessible communication in any kind of health care. In Missouri, it's also covered under the Missouri Human Rights Act, which basically states that interpreters need to be provided for any kind of healthcare system. Now, the Department of Mental Health has recently put together a clinical standards of care for deaf individuals, and in our clinical standards of care, it also mandates that interpreters need to be provided for any kind of mental health setting. In addition to legally being mandated to provide interpreters, there, of course, is the subject of good clinical care. Going back to my discussions on American Sign Language and communication and communication issues, it's just good practice to have an interpreter there, to have somebody to help facilitate communication and to help ensure that the message from the clinician to client is being communicated as well from the client to the clinician. So when we talk about working with interpreters, let's talk a little bit about what the role of the interpreter is. First and foremost, one of the biggest things that I try to educate on throughout the state with both clinicians and with the interpreting field is the interpreter is supposed to be a part of the treatment team. Now again, generally speaking, interpreters do not have education or experience in the mental health field. They are not licensed professional clinicians. They are not caseworkers. They're none of the above, but they are part of the treatment team as the expert on language and on culture. And that's important to keep in mind. Do we have a question?
We do. How would you convince going to a residential school for a first grader leaving his family as opposed to the public ed school teaching?
I'm sorry, can you say that one
So
more
how
time?
would you convince how would you, I guess, sell the point about going to a residential school for a first grader leaving his family as opposed to the public education system?
Oh, that's a tricky, politically loaded kind of question. So I'm not 100% sure how to answer that. Obviously, getting culture and language is the number one concern. If a deaf child can get cultural exposure and can get language exposure locally at their public mental health schools, then it's better for them to stay with their family. I think that's very key for the family to be involved, for the family to learn about the language and get immersed in the culture as well. But that's also kind of a hot button type of topic. So, going back to the interpreter role as part of the treatment team, it's important as a clinician to have that mindset that this interpreter is part of the treatment team. They are not just there to do this. They are there to get involved. Again, with mental health and mental health treatment, communication and culture is very key. And as a hearing clinician, you may or may not have had any experience with a deaf individual before. It's going to be imperative that you have somebody there that you can rely on to get that information, to learn and fill in the gaps that you may be missing when it comes to the communication, to the language, to the culture. That being said, I've often seen hearing clinicians, because they have not had experience working with deaf folks or have no knowledge of American Sign Language or deaf culture, will tend to maybe feel a little insecure about the treatment they're providing, about what they're doing in that mental health setting, and will then rely on the interpreter and ask the interpreter for opinions, thoughts, and ideas regarding mental health treatment. The interpreter is not trained to provide those answers. The interpreter is trained to provide information on culture and language, and that's it. So yes, they need to be a part of the treatment team, but as well, the boundaries need to be there that they are language and culture and not mental health. They are essentially, and the term that I put on the slide here, they are essentially a bridge builder between two cultural groups and two language groups. So when we talk about working with interpreters, I have this broken down into 3 categories, and we'll kind of go through each one of these. Any given session, this can apply to therapy. It may be a case management meeting, maybe a treatment or discharge planning meeting, maybe a psychiatric or psychology appointment, whatever it may be. There should be 3 separate meetings or 3 separate gatherings with clinician and the interpreter. The first one is a pre-session. So before you ever get into the session, it's very important that you leave a few minutes ahead of time to plan to meet with that interpreter. During this pre-session, some of the things that you'll want to accomplish is, number 1, the physical setup of the room and of the session. Where's the deaf client going to sit? Where's the clinician going to sit? Where's the interpreter going to sit? Maybe there's a 3rd or 4th or 5th party involved. Where's everyone going to sit, and where should the interpreter be positioned to facilitate the easiest and least obtrusive? I can't speak today. Wherever the best place is for the interpreter to be, so that it doesn't interfere with the interventions being provided or the assessment or diagnosing or whatever's going on. A couple other things in the pre-session is it is also the clinician's job to give that interpreter enough information that interpreter is going to go into the session prepared to address what's going to happen. And what I mean by that is letting them know what are the topics for today. What kind of things are we going to discuss, or do you plan to discuss in the session? What are the goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Is this an assessment? Is this ongoing therapy? Is this a case management meeting to identify specific resources? Is it a psychiatry appointment, a med management appointment? What is the goal so the interpreter knows a little better what they're getting into? It's also vital at this time to let the interpreter know of any issues that have maybe come up in the past or that may come up in this session. For example, if this is therapy in the last session that you had with this client, some very sensitive information came out and you plan on addressing it in this next session, let the interpreter know so that they're better prepared for what's going to come up. We have a question?
We do. What happens if the interpreter misinterprets what's being said?
That's a great question, and that absolutely can and does happen. So one thing, and I'll talk about it here in just a second, during the session, you want to make sure that to assess ongoing whether understanding is taking place, both on the clinician's part and on the client's part. This is especially important when you have clients that are low level of language skills or minimal language skills, or that may be disfluent. Constantly checking for understanding is going to be very important. We have another question.
Yes. Do you believe there is a strong need for mental health workers to learn ASL, or is it better to stick with an interpreter?
So my opinion on that matter is the minimum standard of care should be using an interpreter. The maximum standard of care should be a clinician that is well versed in culture and language, maybe themselves deaf or hard of hearing, or if they go through and become fluent in American Sign Language, I think that's fantastic. That would be amazing, and we definitely need more clinicians out there that are fluent in American Sign Language and deaf culture. I believe we have another question.
You're on a roll. Currently completing master's program in counseling with my specialty in the physicality of mental health. Where would you suggest I go for resources to learn ASL? And this one would be local to where we are now in the Columbia area.
Columbia area. Okay. Great question. Specifically here in Columbia or wherever you are locally, one of the best way to locate resources is to find maybe an interpreter agency. Oftentimes interpreter agencies are very well aware of what resources are available in the local area. For here in Columbia, definitely there are two that I know of, two major interpreting agencies that you can check with that should, if I'm wrong, don't be mad at me, but should have information on sign language classes or places to check into for sign language classes. In addition, I know the University of Missouri does offer sign language as well as deaf cultural classes. And then William Woods University, which is not too far from here as well, has sign language and deaf cultural classes that you can look into. So let's see, where were we? Pre-session with interpreters, give them the goals, the sensitive information, I think, is where we left off. Any sensitive information you're aware of that may come up in that session, that's a good time to let that interpreter know. In addition to, there will be times when it's not the same interpreter for every session. You may get the same interpreter for 3 sessions in a row, and then for 4, 5, and 6, you'll have a different interpreter. So it may be important at that time to give the interpreter a little information as best as you know on that particular client's language skills, maybe a little bit of history on what's going on with the client. So the interpreter goes into the session and is able to better be prepared for how they're going to need to communicate, for how they're going to need to interpret things, for possible cultural gaps that may arise that they can address. So the second of these is during the actual session. Now, during the actual session, when you're working with the interpreter, it is vitally important that the interpreter, of course, physically is sitting close by to you. It's going to be important that you monitor any side conversations. We know that as mental health clinicians, the establishing a trusting relationship and a bond with the client is vitally important. So you want to make sure that there are no side conversations happening, that anything that's being signed during the session is being interpreted to you. For example, maybe there's a lull in a therapy session and the client and the interpreter appear to be talking. It's important to make sure that that interpreter, and a good interpreter will already know this, is keeping you informed of what's being discussed, of what's being said. But just keeping your eye on that, monitoring the bond between the interpreter and the client, maybe making that a topic of discussion during the session if need be, is going to be very important as well. Also during the session, this is not the time that you want to raise cultural or linguistic questions. Now, I say that again in generalities. If it seems to be a huge impediment to the session, then you might want to go ahead and bring it up. But generally speaking, you want to spend that time focusing 100% on the client and fill some of those gaps in your own misunderstanding later on. Which brings us to the post-session. Now, during the post-session, like I said, this will be the time when you want to, again, leave a few minutes of time to have a wrap-up debriefing type of meeting with the interpreter. And this will be the time when you really want to discuss any cultural confusion or misunderstanding on your part, or maybe there's some linguistic issues that may have come up during the session that you didn't quite understand. This would be a good time to ask the interpreter those questions. And don't be afraid to ask. There's no such thing as a dumb question. It's better to over ask than to under, to make sure that you are fully understanding if there are any cultural or linguistic issues that are happening with the client. Now let's talk a little bit just about some general tips when it comes to working with interpreters. First and foremost is eye contact. Keep in mind, and you know this when you're working with just a regular hearing client, that your eyes are focused on that client, that you're looking at that client, you're making eye contact with that client. At times we're taught to kind of mimic the posture or the stature of the client as well. It's the same thing with the deaf person. You want to do that. You don't want to spend your time looking over and watching the interpreter interpret, because there again, that's going to impact the relationship that you're trying to build with your client. So you want to look at them and speak directly to that client. In addition to that, you want to make sure you're speaking normally. This again has been a huge source of entertainment for me over the years, educating some of the staff that I worked with in the past on how to communicate when there's a deaf client in the room. I've seen everything from yelling at them and talking very loudly, which is not going to help them to hear you any better, to over-articulating, or a combination of the both, or all kinds of other stuff I would have never even thought of. It just makes you look ridiculous. Don't do it. Just speak normally, just like you would a regular conversational tone. If it was a regular hearing person in the room with you, or client that you're working with, you just speak normally. You look at them, you talk to them normally. Speak in I don't know if it's first or third. I always get those things mixed up. But say, I will, you will, and speak in that kind of, using that kind of language versus, hey, tell him blah, 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 blah. Or tell the client blah, 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 blah. Again, I kind of touched on that tip. Avoid addressing the interpreter, particularly when the client is in the room with you. You don't want to have side conversations with that client and cause that deaf person to feel like they're being excluded. When the deaf client's in the room, the focus is on the deaf client. If something needs to be clarified with the interpreter, hopefully it can wait for the post-session or a pre-session. If it absolutely has to be addressed in that moment, then it's important that both you and the interpreter help the deaf client to understand what it is that you're addressing. If it's a cultural misunderstanding, something that you are needing educated on, it's important to tell the deaf person, hey, I'm not quite sure about that. That's something new to me. Let the interpreter fill me in, or let the deaf person educate you as well. A lot of times the deaf clients will be more than happy, more than willing to kind of address any misunderstandings that you may have. It's important to understand as well that when you're working with the deaf client, it's going to take a longer time than it will with a hearing person. Back up and think about when I was explaining about American Sign Language and the differences between American Sign Language and English. And you think about an interpreter who has to take in the English of what you're saying in their head. They have to then translate it into American Sign Language, and then they have to put it out. Then again, when the deaf person replies, they have to take in the sign language, interpret it, and take it. It's a long process. It doesn't look like a long process because interpreters can start to get good at it with experience, but it does take time. So there's going to be a longer process. In an hour session with a deaf person, you may accomplish half of what you would with a hearing person just because of the language difficulties and the delays that might occur between the interpreter interpreting, as well as the needing to constantly check for understanding, which is vitally important. Constantly checking that what the interpreter told you is definitely what the deaf person intended, and what you have told the deaf person they fully understand. That is key to having good, solid mental health treatment with a deaf individual. We have a question.
If you know sign language, should you use it with the client even though you are not an interpreter?
That is a tricky question to answer as well. Sign language is just like any other foreign language. I might know a few Spanish words, but it doesn't mean that I'm fluent. So you may know a few signs, and I don't know what the case is with this particular person asking the question, but just because you know a few signs, maybe you know a lot of signs, I would not say that that's probably good enough to be providing mental health treatment. You need to make sure that you are fully fluent, which takes years of training and immersion in the deaf world before you can really consider yourself fluent. Now, if you are fluent, then absolutely, please provide direct services to your deaf client. If it's just, I know a lot of signs, I took a couple of sign classes, generally speaking, I would say that is not good enough for a mental health session or for a mental health setting, and it's more important to have an interpreter there. Now, if you just took a few sign classes, or maybe you do feel like you have some fluency, but you're not involved in the deaf culture, maybe you're not fully fluent in deaf culture, then again, it's going to be important to have an interpreter there to fill in those gaps and those cultural misunderstandings. We have another question?
Yep. Do you suggest then that a longer session, or simply accepting that less might be accomplished in the standard 50-minute session?
That's a great question. Either or, to be honest with you. It kind of depends on your personal preference. If you have the time to spend longer than, let's use just therapy as a general example, is 50 minutes. If you decide to do an hour and a half just to try to get more accomplished, then absolutely, that's a great idea. If you have schedule restrictions and, you can only do 50-minute sessions, then just planning on it's going to take a little bit longer, you're going to cover a little bit less, and knowing that that's the reality of it is good enough as well. So, I don't believe we touched on this last tip I pulled up here. During the sessions in particular, it's also going to be important to address any concerns that the client may have. And my suggestion is that you flat out ask the client if they have any concerns. Having an interpreter with the room in them, sometimes deaf clients will feel a little bit shy about saying, hey, maybe I know this interpreter, or maybe I don't feel comfortable with this particular person, or maybe I have a hard time understanding this particular interpreter's signing. They may shy away from sharing that with you. So it's probably good, in general, just once in a while, check in with the client about how they feel the mental health setting's going, how they feel the interpreter's doing, how comfortable they still are with the interpreter. The deaf community is very small and very inclusive, and a lot of times, particularly when it's in smaller areas or maybe in rural areas, there's only a handful of interpreters. So a deaf person may see the same interpreter for their doctor checkup visit, for their dentist, for their therapy session, for their kids' parent-teacher conferences, for their kids' play. So there may be an interpreter that's involved in a lot of aspects in their lives, as well as interpreters that are just involved in the deaf community and social events, and maybe the deaf person knows the interpreter on a social level. So it's important to make sure that client has an outlet to express concerns that they may have with the interpreter, or to express uncomfortableness. So that may be something the clinician addresses. When you're working with a deaf person, it's important to make sure that the concepts that you're discussing and sharing with that client are very concrete. Again, going back to American Sign Language, being that it's a visual language and we're painting a picture, tree, boy, climb, that doesn't leave a lot of room for abstract type of thinking. It's a very concrete thinking, very concrete language. So, same thing in a mental health setting, you want to make sure that you're being very concrete. One example that I've given before is, brief solution-focused therapy. There's a technique called the miracle question, which is a very abstract concept saying, let's pretend that tonight while you're sleeping a miracle happens and yada, yada, yada. It's very difficult to translate into sign language. So it may not be a tool that you want to use. You may want to get in your toolkit, use something else. Be very concrete, give very specific examples to help illustrate and help them to visualize the point that you're trying to get across. And with deaf culture, it tends to be very direct and very blunt. Again, this is a result of, number one, American Sign Language being a visual language, and number two, just being a very small community. It kind of happens. One example I like to give is we had a family friend that I hadn't seen from high school on, and just like I hope everybody in the world, I put on a few pounds in college. So the next time that I saw him, the first thing out of his mouth was, "Wow, you got fat." Now in hearing culture, we would go, "Oh man, this guy's a jerk. Why would he say something like that to me?" But in deaf culture, that's just how it works. We tend to be very descriptive and very visually descriptive. So instead of saying, "Hey, look at that guy over by the door," I'm going to say, "You see that guy, fat, big head, standing over there?" It's not being insulting. It's just describing and explaining what that person looks like and giving a visual picture. So there again, in a mental health setting, it's okay to be very direct and blunt, and a lot of times it's okay to be more inquisitive. And what I mean by that is sometimes when we're working with clients, we kind of tiptoe and dance around sensitive subjects. If you're working with a deaf person, it's a little easier and a little better to be very direct, blunt, ask them specific questions, ask them very personal questions. It's not going to be detrimental to the trusting relationship because that's how the culture is anyways. Do we have a question?
Do professionals use other modalities, such as email, to communicate with deaf clients about issues that the client might be uncomfortable bringing up with the interpreter?
Again, excellent question. That may happen. I can't really say yes, that's what they do, or yes, that does happen. I myself have never experienced that. I've never spoken to anyone who's experienced that. And I would encourage that if they are not feeling comfortable enough with the interpreter to bring something up in the session, it might be time to try to find another interpreter or try to figure out another option. Obviously, anything that's very sensitive needs to be discussed face-to-face with your therapist in the therapy session. So that's definitely, if that comes up, should be an issue that gets addressed. So that's the end of kind of my formal presentation for today. I appreciate everybody coming out or joining up and listening to me. And let's go ahead, and if you have questions, feel free to ask away.
Also remind everyone that it's a good time to purchase the CEUs. If you're interested in CEUs, that link is underneath the captioning window. That link will stay open for a little while after the program, as well as be sent to you in a follow-up email. Also, the link to the slides will be sent to you in that follow-up email. And, of course, there is the links to the Spring Training Institute. Now, the question has come in. Is it common for the communication barrier that may exist between hearing patients who do not learn to sign and their deaf children to affect them negatively in the future?
I apologize. Can you say that one more time?
Is it common for the communication barrier that may exist between hearing parents who do not learn to sign and their deaf children to affect them negatively in the future?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest things that we see is the reaction of hearing parents with deaf children. I can't tell you how many times I've had a mother and a child come into therapy session, and I basically serve as the interpreter. They've never talked to each other their whole life, and the mom will go, "What? She really said that? She really thinks that?" And then the daughter or son or whatever will say, "What? Mom really thinks that? I had no clue." And it turns out that just having that communication barrier and being able to bring those two together has a huge positive impact. And on the negative side, it does have a negative impact. A lot of times we'll see hearing parents that will become severely enmeshed with their deaf children, whether it's because, I feel bad that this person's deaf and has to live life deaf, so I'm going to do everything I possibly can for them. One example, I had a mother-daughter. The daughter was 40-some years old. Mom was getting into her 80s and was getting to the point where she could not continue this enmeshment that she had. But she would cook, clean, do laundry, drive, entertain, do everything for this 40-year-old who never learned independent living skills. So it was a huge impact. It impacted both of them, their entire, lives and adult lives. So.
All right. Well, I think we ran the gamut of the questions. I think you got an awful lot of them that came in during the presentation. Folks, I want to take time to thank you for joining us this afternoon. It looks like we managed to pull this off, even though we were outside of our comfort zone as far as being in Columbia rather than in St. Louis. Sometimes that's how it works. But we thank you for joining us. Please join us at Spring Institute if you're able. Our next program is actually tomorrow afternoon. It's at 2 o'clock. It's a 2 o'clock Central Time start time rather than our usual 1:30. And we invite you to hear our director, Dr. Joe Parks, and he's going to be talking about integrating behavioral health care along with primary care. So join us if you're able to do that. Otherwise, forward our emails along to your friends. Make sure you're on our email list so that you can keep up to date on these and our future programs. So thank you for taking the time to join us. Elijah, thanks for your time and your expertise today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.